Hi, everyone. Dr. Patrick Powell here with you again. This week we are discussing risk factors and consequences for sexual addiction. So we're going to jump right on in. I'm going to open up my screen to you. Okay. So today we're going to discuss relationships in terms of risk factors in relationships, cross addictions, and we'll talk about that in a bit, internet pornography, cyber sex risk, dual diagnosis, and medical risk. One thing that's pretty prevalent in the literature is that often individuals with sexual addiction will find a partner that also has sexual addiction. Again, because you have two parties, though, neither of which know how to healthily sexually engage, and neither of which may be great at boundaries, and both of which probably have poor coping skills, those relationships do not tend to work out terribly well. Carnes noted that many people with sexual addiction want to feel loved, but they really do have a skewed idea of what love is. That love often translates to having a sexual power over others, and that thought can become really maladaptive and impactful in adulthood whenever an individual attempts to engage in a relationship with other people. Turner noted that people with sexual addiction are often desperate for an encounter because, again, if you think back to what we covered last week, sexual encounters are how people cope, how they regulate. They're so desperate, though, that they often don't think about the normal things that a person considers in terms of sexual activity, such as, is it the right time? Do we trust and respect one another? Are we both accountable for this decision? Are we honest? Many people just blunder ahead into sexual activity. And again, that can have unfortunate consequences in terms of what it means for the relationship or for that person when another relationship fails and this person thinks, I've done it again. I'm never going to be successful in a relationship. It is not uncommon, again, for an individual to enter into a sexual relationship with another individual with a sexual addiction. They often have very similar family types. Again, rigid or detached families, where people learn to overlook their own needs and desires in an effort to save other people. Again, if you recall from the integrated model I discussed last week, children get into this habit of saving parents, and they carry that habit well into adulthood, and they feel the need to save other people. Sometimes to satisfy people, individuals may try to be sexier or try to gratify whatever sexual needs an individual with sexual addiction has. It's ultimately fruitless, though, because, again, you can't satiate something that is a never-ending well of want, for lack of a better phrase. And that can ultimately lead an individual's partner to feel unaccomplished, incapable, and failed. Let's talk for just a moment about cross addictions. You may remember in one of our earlier interactions, we talked about the addictive personality. And again, it's theorized that some individuals have addictive natures, whether it's one chemical or another. Individuals will move from one addiction to another to another. For those of you that work in the substance field, you may have seen this in terms of treating alcoholism. When individuals are treated for alcohol, it is not uncommon for them to suddenly develop another addiction, such as cigarettes or caffeine and coffee or that sort of thing. Kafka and Hennon have done some work looking at the correlation between individuals that had substance and chemical addiction. They noted 40% of their sample that self-described as having hypersexual behavior also reported substance abuse. Again, when you don't know how to address your wants or needs, people will often find multiple ways to attempt to do it. So a person may not just be dealing with a sexual addiction, they may be dealing with a behavioral addiction on top of that. Again, that link between drug addiction and sexual addiction is just reinforced when people try to escape the emotional consequences of their actions. So sometimes you'll see it in a cycle. An individual will feel guilty or sad or upset about, once again, he or she had sex in a way they did not want to. And this person will then try chemicals to alleviate those symptoms. And then they'll feel guilty about the chemical use. whenever they did not want to. And again, it can just be a cycle of sexual addiction and chemical addiction, because ultimately, again, this person does not have a stable way to address his or her feelings. But after sexual behavior, people are, again, they're devastated. And to mitigate those feelings, again, substance use. It's worth noting there are some drugs that heighten sexual experiences. You see a lot used in clubs, and you've probably heard of ecstasy or something along those lines. If you're not in the substance field, you've probably at least heard of that. But there are a lot of drugs that will heighten sensual feelings and heighten touch. So some individuals that experience sexual disorders will involve those drugs as a part of their process or as a part of their ritual. So we see substance addiction becoming comorbid with chemical addiction. We see substance addiction becoming comorbid with sexual addiction. Dagenhart and Top in 2003 noted that meth has been found to increase sex desire and sensation while decreasing sexual inhibition. So meth, a very prolific drug here in the United States, one that's it's just pervasive across the U.S. in terms of how widespread it is and how damaging methamphetamine can be. But again, it heightens sexual experiences and lowers sexual inhibition. So you can see that individuals with a methamphetamine addiction may be prone to more frequent sexual acts or more sexual activity. Estalone and Morris noted that poppers, GHB, gamma, butyrolactone, cocaine, crystal, hashish, poppers, often these drugs can be used to heighten sexual pleasure. And these are not hard drugs to find. You can find them in clubs and you can find them in some surprising places. Sniffed in a non-medical use, a lot of these are almost immediate. That high is like that. Now it's brief, but it comes really quick. So a person can have an intense pleasurable sensation, and again, lowered levels of impulse control. An individual feels a strong sensation of inner heat and sensuality. A sniff lasts about 2 minutes. GHB, you'll hear of GHB sometimes referred to as the date rape drug or things like that. It can come in a lot of different forms. It can be in a liquid form. It can be drank. It can be mixed with an alcohol form. It just elevates a person's euphoria level, and it increases their level of overall relaxation, and it heightens sexual excitement. Depending upon that dosage, a person may just be sleepy. They may be comatose. They may be unconscious. They may be aware, but they may have lost their inhibitions. Their perception may be intensified where everything really stands out, or they may experience vertigo. But I think it's worth noting that, when we combine, or when we see drug use specifically used to heighten sexual behavior, that is going to have an impact on individuals with sexual addiction. The awareness of these drugs amongst individuals with sexual addiction is pretty clear. They're a pretty aware population. Let's transition and talk about internet pornography for a minute, and we'll talk about the difference between this and cybersex. But internet pornography is specifically viewing pornography across an electronic portal. You may be looking at images, you may be reading erotica, you may be watching videos. But it's been a huge issue for individuals with sexual addiction, a huge issue, because it's readily available. You don't need another person for it. You can hop online, you can go to any number of websites, which I'm not listing here, obviously, but you can find any number of websites that will display video clips or things like that. And outside of those specific websites that tailor to showing brief porn clips, there are also pornography sites related to specific fetishes. For instance, for people that have foot fetishes, there are specific websites that have images of feet or things like that. So the availability of pornography has really exacerbated some individuals' sexual addiction, because it is something that when they're feeling stressed or they need to cope, they can always go to and they can always find it. Carroll et al. Noted that 87% of that sample of men and women reported using internet porn, with a significant proportion engaging in weekly or monthly use. Filaritu in 2005 stated that an increased use of internet pornography has been associated also with depression, anxiety, and relationship intimacy. Let's talk about that for just a moment. I think it's worth noting. When you look at the use of pornography, specifically within a relationship, it is not uncommon for partners to look at an individual and go, "You're using pornography. Am I not good enough for you?" And to feel their own level of self-doubt and shame, and that in turn causes relationship conflict. But it's also not uncommon for people that are not in relationships, for people that are single, to look at pornography and see other people engaging in sexuality and feel depressed or anxious that they are not. So, just in terms of pornography in and of itself, it can have a detrimental effect. I know I spoke in an earlier module about sexuality being helpful in a therapeutic context, and I do believe that. It can be in terms of if you're dealing with an individual that has a low libido that is looking for a stimulus, or if you're dealing with a couple who are trying to maybe revive some of that magic that hasn't been there in a while. But it can have a detrimental effect as well. Cybersex is different than pornography. Pornography is specifically looking at images or video or reading stories that would lead one to fantasize or that sort of thing. Cybersex is actual sexual engagement through the internet, and it is a major industry. You don't need to look any further than web camera individuals that are offering for you to pay, X amount of money, and they'll turn on the webcam and do, whatever it is that you suggest or that sort of thing. 60% of all internet activity involves a sexual purpose. I think that is a stunning statistic. For anyone that doubts the financial wherewithal of sexuality, you need only look back about 30 years at VHS and Betamax. The pornography industry decided to go with VHS, and suddenly overnight it became the prolific format for distributing film and that sort of thing. But anyway, I'm sorry, went off on a bit of a tangent there. Going back to this, 60% of all internet activity is a stunning number. Rosenberg noted that 40 million people log into porn sites every day. That's 13% of the population. 13% of the population log in every day to pornography. The authors noted that internet-based form of sex addiction include viewing and or distributing pornography, masturbation, reading and writing sexually explicit letters or stories, emailing to set up personal meetings with someone, placing ads to meet sexual partners. Craigslist is a particular haven for that, but it's also a challenge sometimes because you've probably all read news stories about people meeting people across Craigslist for various sexual encounters, and some rough stuff happened to some people. They didn't know who they were meeting. Visiting sexually oriented chat rooms, engaging in interactive online affairs that include real-time viewing. And when you engage with someone sexually, and now we're going back to cybersex, but when you engage with someone sexually, if you have a partner that you're living with, of course that's going to damage that relationship. And more so when we think about cybersex, you're building to a degree, a fictional relationship. Yes, you can see the person and that sort of thing. But when you're in a face-to-face relationship with someone, you have to, you address the things that you like about that relationship and that person. But over time, you see the things that you don't like, and that becomes a part of a relationship is, how do I tolerate these things I don't like because I ultimately love and want to be with this person? It's easy to, it is easy to see a person on the other end of a screen and make them whoever you want them to be. And it's so easy that further reinforces people going online and engaging in these sort of relationships. I had a client a few years back, and that client preferred to date online without ever actually meeting the people for that reason. And he engaged sexually with some of these people across the web. But that's the thing. It's an idealistic setting sometimes because you don't have to see the bad and the ugly. You just see the good. Badia noted that internet-based sex addiction results, let me rephrase that, internet-based sexual addiction occurs more often than some other forms because it's anonymous and it's convenient. If you're going to try to engage with someone sexually outside of someone that you know, you can approach a prostitute or things like that, but that would detail contact with that person, and there's a huge risk to that, medically, legally, and in any other number of ways. You could go to a strip club or something like that, but if someone sees you, they may be able to identify you, and you may feel shameful. With cybersex, it can be anonymous. You can develop a screen name and pop up on any number of webcams. There's a program, I can't remember the name of it, but about 3 years ago it was very popular, and individuals would just rotate to different webcams, and it was random how it worked. They ended up having to shut the site down because so many times you would pop open to a web camera and it would be someone with their genitalia out, or something along those lines. When people feel as though they are anonymous, people are emboldened to do things that they would not do in normal life. Also, it's convenient. People don't have to leave their home to have sex across the internet with another person. They may have to if they're responding to, Twitter, not Twitter, Tinder, Grindr, or if they're again going out to procure sex through some means. But also, if you look at how we are reached now through technology, it's frightening in some ways. I mean, there are any number of viruses that will populate your computer with sexual images or sexual messages. You can go to a website and a pop-up window will pop up. One of my clients games a lot, video games a lot online, and that client was telling me that a pop-up continues to pop up of digital characters having sex on the corner of the screen while this person is playing. And think about your apps for a moment. If you look at your phone, there are dating apps, and then there are sexual hookup apps. Again, I mentioned two, Grindr, Tinder. For individuals with fetishes, there's Kinked, and any other number of apps. So, how we are reached by the sex industry continues to populate and continues to be expansive. For the majority of us, that's not a big deal because we can moderate our impulses and be just fine. For individuals with sexual addictions, it is a huge issue. Because anytime an individual with sexual addiction faces a sexual situation, he or she can be automatically triggered and in that place. A couple more comments. In terms of internet-based sex behavior, Dar noted that 7 in 10 individuals keep online sexual activities a secret. 1 in 5 of those are men, 1 in 8 of those are women, use computers at work to access sexual material. The unfortunate thing that happens when sexuality becomes a secret is that we become so proficient at hiding it, we're emboldened to enact upon it. Look at that statistic. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 8 women use computers at work to access sexual material. For most of us, you're going to see that and think, why in the world would you do that? For an individual with sexual addiction, it doesn't matter where he or she is going to try to procure that sexual excitement or that sexual engagement in some way. Going on 6 times as many men engaged in online sexual pursuits as women. 17% of respondents that were not at risk before the internet may be vulnerable to sex addiction that interferes with their daily lives. So, in the study that Dyer did, 17% of the respondents stated that they did not feel as though they were at risk for sexual addiction prior to the internet. Additionally, 1 in 5 internet individuals with sexual addiction are engaged in some form of online sexual activity. 1 in 5 people. Again, 1 in 5 individuals are engaged in sexual activity if they're online. There's nothing inherently wrong with cyber sex or engaging sexually with someone online, as long as both parties are consenting. There's nothing inherently wrong with the practice. If you think about individuals who may be apart from one another, that might be a way for couples to engage when they have to be at a distance from one another. So I definitely don't want to state that, cyber sex in and of itself is bad or automatically leads to a negative outcome. It's dangerous for vulnerable populations. And by vulnerable populations, I'm referring to individuals with sexual addiction or individuals with troubling sexual issues. Some users, 8 to 10%, become hooked on it and experience significant life problems as a result. And again, the consequences for that can really fall into two categories. Because of the amount of time a person spends online, they may lose friendships, and their partner may not be there for them, their children may feel neglected. And that is a significant risk. When you think of engaging in cyber sex on a frequent behavior, that requires you to be in front of a computer or your phone. Also, those that specifically relate to the sexual content of the user's activity. That may lead a person to meet offline, resulting in the transmission of sexual diseases. If a person engages in sexual activity with someone in the workplace, they may lose employment if they're arrested for whatever they're setting up online. An arrest may result in unemployment. It may also damage an individual's self-esteem, or a partner's self-esteem, rather. So, I mean, there are some really tangible losses that can occur when individuals engage in cyber sex and choose to meet afterwards, especially. Ramirez and Sitzman noted that, our previous conceptualization of sexual addiction is that it develops from a history of abuse and insecure attachment patterns, poor impulse control, and often presents with other addictions and comorbid mood disorders. I think from what we talked about last week, that's fairly easily understandable. And that is our classic model of addiction, and specifically sexual addiction. These authors proposed a new form that is based specifically in cyber sex. The authors proposed a rapid onset model that occurs quickly. That's really the result of our internet-based technology, and distinguished by 3 C's. Chronicity, it's chronic, it is always there. Content, the content is ample. If you have any sexual interest or any fetish, you are likely to be able to find it online. And culture. Our culture has really adapted to internet use. I want you for just a moment to think about the last time you were browsing Facebook, or the last time you were browsing some social networking site on your phone, some interest group like Pinterest or something along those lines. Our culture has adapted us, or we've adapted our culture, to not be present all of the time in what they call IRL, in real life, but to be involved in technology and to be communicating and to be engaged across that way with other people. Again, Ramirez and Sitzman's model suggested that sexual addiction results from early exposure to graphic sexual content that impacts your neurochemical, sexual, and social development. And again, as a result of chronicity, content, and allowing culture, we reinforce it again and again and again. So it's worth noting that some individuals are looking at cyber sex as having its own causality model in terms of sexual addiction. So let's transition and just talk about dual diagnoses for a moment. We talked briefly at the beginning of this conversation about substance abuse disorders occurring with chemical disorders. Well, that being said, there are an incredible number of mental health diagnoses that also occur as a result. If you take just a moment and think about sexual addiction, an individual is likely to feel a heightened degree of anxiety based around his or her sexual addiction and sexual behaviors and sexual fantasies. An individual is also likely to feel a heightened degree of depression related to being unable to abstain, along with guilt or shame when he or she enacts behavior that they did not want to do. So depression, anxiety, and other disorders are relatively comorbid with sexual addiction. Raymond, Coleman, and Miner in 2003 noted that 100% of their sample of individuals with sexual addiction met criteria for an Axis 1 disorder. Now, that's a DSM-1 term, Axis 1. It's that the axes are no longer in the DSM-5, so if you were untrained on those, I'll just state that an Axis 1 disorder would be considered your major disorder. It pretty much included all disorders except for anything dealing with what was then mental retardation and personality disorders. It included pretty much everything else. So when you talk depression, anxiety, OCD, psychosis, mania, all of that fell on axis 1. Kafka and Hennon noted that 72% of their patients in a sample with hypersexual behavior reported mood disorders, 38% reported anxiety disorders. If you're looking at that number, well, that's 100% when you add up depression and anxiety. Verbovic interviewed 153 people who were described at that time as sexually compulsive. So a difference in terminology. Again, I think you're seeing what we talked about in the first week. The terminology is different depending upon who's doing the research. They noted 16% of those individuals experiencing depression. That's similar to Weiss's study where 18.4% met criteria for depression. Again, there's a giant leap between the first two studies where we see roughly 100% and the last two studies where we see closer to 15 or somewhere around there. Until we get on the same page about what we're actually researching, it's going to be challenging to have a reliable data set. Nair, Pawar, Kalra, and Shah studied 93 individuals with mood and anxiety disorders. Of that population, 69.8 met criteria for a mood disorder. A fourth of that population met criteria for hypersexual disorder. So again, there's some strong correlations. They also noted that a quarter of their population met criteria for an anxiety disorder. Nelson, Alert noted a significant level of anxiety in their research population, and they were exploring individuals with sexual addiction as well. Short, Letterneck, Risticki, Shutter, and Chase noted that 88.3% of their participants felt like their clients, and again, the individuals they are researching are therapists. Those therapists felt like their clients with problematic sexual behaviors also had comorbid diagnoses, including mood disorders. 69% felt mood disorders, followed by anxiety disorders, impulse control, and substance abuse. So again, the authors felt that 88.3% of therapists felt like their clients with problematic sexual behaviors also had comorbid diagnoses. I want you to really think about that for just a moment. And aside from the obvious statistic that came out of it, what I hope you see in that is there is a recognition of, regardless of how we're labeling it, there's a staggering amount of clinicians that that recognize problematic sexual behaviors in the forms, well, they recognize problematic sexual behavior. We'll leave it there because that's how they phrased it. What I hope you start to glean is, the issue amongst some clinicians is very accepted. However, it's still not amongst all of us. Anyway, going back to dual diagnosis, Raymond, Coleman, and Miner commented that including paranoid, passive-aggressive, and narcissistic personality disorders were reported in association with hypersexual behavior. Now, that's a bit of a new avenue in terms of the conversations we have been having, because we've primarily been talking about depression, anxiety, and things like that. These authors are stating that personality disorders were correlated with hypersexual behavior. We don't have a lot of data for that. We're going to talk about in when we get to the treatment module, and I think we're going to get there, we'll get there in module 5. When we get to the treatment module, we're going to talk about the psychodynamic approach, which focuses on specific personality factors in terms of treatment. But I think that's where we start to see this research being applicable. A couple of other comments. And I did not include the year here. I can go back and find that for you. But looking at a study that encompassed 4 universities, exploring whether 132 individuals with sexual addiction also had comorbid personality disorders, the authors found that 92% of those people had some personality-based mental dysfunction. And a total of 17% met criteria for at least one of 10 personality disorders. The correlating personality disorders to sexual addiction Obviously, you can tell by the fact that Raymond, Coleman, and Miner did their study in 2003. You can tell that this has been a thought for a long time. We don't see personality disorders correlated as often, though. When it comes to mental health dual diagnoses, we see more studies evidencing depression, anxiety, and so on, and impulse control disorders as well. Moving on to other risks, I think medical risks are evident even without the discussion. But I think it's worth noting that some individuals with sexual addiction will purposefully stop using condoms because it limits sensation. When people stop using condoms, again, it opens them up to incredible risk, including HIV, HIV, hepatitis, and any other number of medical concerns. Also, when people use drugs, we talked about this earlier in this discussion, actually, when people utilize drugs, their ability to recognize what's happening, their ability to moderate themselves, their ability to control their impulses is diminished. And individuals may be more likely, again, to have sex without condoms. The term barebacking has been a term that's used for a while, but it basically refers to having sex without a condom. It's used often, or that term and that particular behavior of having sex without a condom is prevalent in the field of sexual addiction. I think all the consequences of barebacking are potentially unfortunate, but one additional piece to consider is that when an individual contracts an STD or something like that, he may transmit it to his or her partner, and they may be unaware of what's happening, and they may be unaware of the health risk that they are taking on. Also, just in terms of medical risk, some individuals with sexual addiction, we talked about escalating behavior. Some individuals will practice some behaviors that are truly damaging. And you'll have to forgive some of the terminology that I've included here. But with fist fucking, people use their fist and they typically insert it in someone. And if you think about that, that could be incredibly damaging to a person. Bondage, where people beat one another, sometimes with whips, sometimes with studs, and that sort of thing. Just a couple more. Scatophilia, where people defecate on one another. These are incredibly risky behaviors. Just in terms with scatophilia, germ transmission. With bondage, people have broken bones, people have scars, people have lacerations. There's plenty of people that enjoy sexuality related to cutting. So there's blood loss, and when there's blood loss, I mean, there's not only the risk of running out of your own blood, but again, of transmitting bloodborne illnesses to other individuals. So when we talk about medical risk, they are amplified with individuals with sexual addictions, specifically those individuals that escalate behavior up to the extremes. So that's a majority of what I wanted to talk about in terms of risk and other factors to consider. Next time we touch base, we're going to be in Module 4. And in Module 4, we're going to talk about assessment and diagnosis. What you're going to find is diagnosis has an incredibly, just challenging history in terms of there have been times when, as a field, we've been really strong about the fact that there is something happening here we need to pay attention to and treat. And there have been times when we've just backed off of that completely. But we'll go over the history of that next time, and we'll talk about where we currently stand in terms of you being able to diagnose something related to a sexual addiction. We're also going to go over some methods of assessing sexual addiction. But what I will say at this point even is, when you're talking about assessing sexual addiction, you're primarily doing that for treatment purposes because, again, it's not a valid diagnosis in the DSM-5. So it doesn't have a lot of utility in terms of evidencing a diagnosis, but it can be helpful in terms of treatment and laying out a treatment trajectory. But again, we'll talk about all of that next time. In the meantime, you all take care, and we'll see you next time.